Mary Ann Kalavich teaches up at Millersville University and is also a good friend of ours, and we're happy to have her here today. She's been doing some research with kids, and as you know, in our Art and Human Development class, we're getting ready to do something similar. So what I'd like to do is to have another example of some things that you can test out with kids.
Okay.
Take it from
I'm going to back up just a little bit to something that Al mentioned earlier, and that had to do with this whole idea of instruction. Most of the people that you've heard talk today have a fairly passionate belief in the development of children, both through their artistic behaviors and the growth and being involved in all sorts of visual experiences. Well, a gazillion and a half years ago, somewhere after the flood, when I started teaching art, I began to raise this question because I would see things that kids would do in my art room, and then I would have classroom teachers come to me and say, well, Marion, how come if the kids do this, so they do these wonderful little drawings in your art room, and then they come back to my room and they do these awful little squiggly things? So I began to question something and say to myself, okay, well, where does development leave off? Where does instruction begin? And in essence, how do the two coalesce? So if we are in fact going to be art teachers, what are we going to accomplish? You know, are those kids going to go back to their classroom in third grade and still always put the sun in the corner and the green stripe at the bottom and the blue stripe at the top, which we've taught them for 2 weeks not to do? Probably. But anyway, my question began to be then, well, okay, what difference then does instruction make? I've been doing some research for the past about 6 years with kindergarten children in Lancaster City schools and in 2 suburban schools that are right outside of Millersville. And I have a project ongoing with the kindergarten teachers and the art teachers in those schools to have a collection of self-portraits that the kindergarten children draw the first day they come to the art class, to get an idea of, you know, where are they basically in their development. Now, much of developmental theory that you read about, graphic developmental theory, is based on realism and the children's ability to draw realistic imagery. Now, there's a lot of controversy, is that good, is that bad? That's not my intent here today. But it is my intent to talk about that since we tend to base so much of what we know about children's development because of what we see them doing graphically or the realistic kinds of drawings that they do, and in particular, the drawings of people. When I first started teaching, the schools in Pennsylvania still used an old test called the Goodenow Draw a Man test, and of which, by the way, there's a gazillion copies of these drawings at Penn State, I believe owns them now. But when you entered kindergarten, you had part of your kindergarten test was to draw a person, or in the pre-PC days, draw a man. And these were used as a way to sort of analyze where kids were developmentally. So this is sort of a long history, how we look at children's drawings. So anyway, my question became, though, if I'm the art teacher and I know that children are going to draw in a particular way, and I've given them a pretest, in this case I've asked them to draw a portrait of themselves, and then I give them instruction, how meaningful is that instruction? In other words, does instruction in fact affect in any way their development? Now, since we all know there's a ton of variables on development, it's not an easy question to answer. And I'm not so sure that I completely have the answer, but let me explain a little bit about what I am doing, and then I have some samples to show you, and what I think perhaps we're finding out in the process. So far we've involved close to 900 children over the last 6 years in this little project. And interestingly enough, the School District of Lancaster has picked this up because they're under the gun in Pennsylvania to meet the state standards for testing, and they want to look at some of these other issues. Sandy's information and discussion earlier about the talented portion and the gifted portion. So there's a whole lot of opportunities for you as art teachers to get on the bandwagon with the testing issue and become a part of it. Okay, so here's what we did. First, as I said, the children came in, they were given a piece of, 9 by 12 paper, and in most cases black marker. They could choose a crayon or a pencil or whatever they really wanted to, and they were asked to draw a picture of themselves. It took, for those of you that have worked with kindergarten children, about 5 minutes or so. We collected them, we put the date, we put their name, and got the birthdays from the teachers so we knew exactly how old the children are. And because of Pennsylvania state law for entrance into kindergarten, the chronological variation was not huge. Okay, they were all fairly close, within about 6 months of each other as far as age. So this was the first week they came to the art class. The second week that they came to the art class, the teacher, and in some cases my student teachers, did an instructed, very structured lesson on how to draw a person. And they created some charts that showed how a person was divided. You had the head, you had the body, where the arms were, where the legs were. We had mirrors, large standing mirrors set around the room so that the children can go and look at themselves and see, well, what color's my hair, what color are my eyes, what kind of clothing do I have on? And then we asked the children to redraw their self-portrait. We gave them a slightly larger piece of paper, 12 by 18 instead of 9 by 12. So, you're going to see dramatic differences between the child's, what we might call natural developmental place, and what I refer to as their instructed place. But the question for me went further than that. Would this instruction in any way really affect the child's natural or personal development, uninstructed development? So I then divided the classes, the kindergarten classes, into 2 separate groups with the cooperation of the kindergarten teacher. The one group of children went back to their kindergarten class, and they had some art activities and the kinds of general involvement in art would happen in a kindergarten. But there was no real reinforcement of the lesson that had occurred in the art room. The other group of kindergarten children went back to their classroom, and again, in cooperation with the kindergarten teacher and with the help of my students to set up little centers, we put up a center in the classroom where children basically had unlimited access to drawing materials. We had a big mirror there. We had the little poster that we'd created in the art room that showed how a person might be drawn, and we just left those kinds of things there. And we asked the kindergarten teacher to also, when she or he worked with the classes, to show the children in their illustrations when they were reading stories, well, here's how this artist drew a person, or here's a picture of a person, notice how they look. So there was constant, in essence, reinforcement of the learning that had gone on in the previous art class. We let them lapse then for 3 weeks because we really wanted to try as much as possible to factor out the sort of natural development that might take place over time. 3 weeks later, we had the children come back to the art room, and at the beginning of their art class, just as we had done the first week, we asked the children to draw a picture of themselves. The plan, of course, was to see how much had carried over from the instructed drawing, if in fact it changed in any way how the children approached the drawing. The good news is that for most of the children, we found a huge increase in their developmental place in the reinforced classroom, the classroom that had artistic examples, that were given opportunities to draw in specific ways, that the discussion on a person and what they looked like continued. We also saw that in the classes that did not have the reinforcement, in essence, with some few exceptions, the children really did not move forward all that much from the original drawing. So you're going to see a remarkable difference between the original drawing and the drawing they did in the instructed level, and then not much difference between the before and after kind of picture. Now, what this tells me is something that I think in my heart I've always known. Research tends to be trying to answer questions you already think you have the answer for, and sometimes you don't. But in this case, I think I proved the point in the fact that as teachers we have to remember is that yes, there are some types of visual parameters that we can put on children's growth, that there are definite changes that occur across time. But I think what we also have to understand and really put into play is that as our teachers, we have to realize that our instruction to children may or may not influence their developmental change, and it's predictable upon whether, in fact, they're sort of ready for the change. I use the example with my students. Can you teach 3-point or 1-point perspective to third graders? Well, the answer to that question is yes, you can teach 1-point perspective to third graders. Will third graders apply 1-point perspective to their individual personal drawings? Most of them will not. But some of them that are in essence at the point cognitively to move on to dealing with space in new ways may apply those lessons. So as teachers, we have to realize that what we have with our kids in an art classroom is a particular moment in time. And the influence that we have on them may not be noticeable at this exact time, but it will, in all probability, show up later on. Because I'm going to continue the story, unfortunately I don't have examples of these. We also did with these kindergarten children another self-portrait at the end of the school year. And in this case, the dramatic difference between the reinforcement of the figure drawing in one class and in the other was really quite large. Unfortunately, I had a little flooding, speaking of things happening in my storage area where all the images from this last group were housed, and I really lost most, so I'm starting that collection all over again. So what does this mean? Well, let me just show you, because for all of us, I think pictures are worth 1,000 words. Well, I'm going to, no, because I have actually sort of a structure to this. But the first one I'm going to show you was done by a child, and there was very minimal beginning. So if we look at the right-hand side where my hand is, we see the first drawing. This was the drawing that the child did, self-portrait. So if you kind of know your Rhoda Kellogg, you might remember what this is called. She sort of refers to them as aggregates. Okay, now, 1 week later, with an instructed lesson, the child drew the center one. Now we're looking at someone that really is not much out of the scribble stage or the mark making stage as I refer to it in the book. Here, this isn't a really, really good drawing of a person, but it's an amazing jump for the child who is over here. The drawing on this side was done 3 weeks later, so there's 1 month between this drawing and this drawing. Now again, while we don't have a completely formed symbol that we'd see later on, the difference between that drawing and that drawing is quite remarkable. Okay? So that's one example. Another example from a class where the children did not have reinforced learning, dealing with their development, or just talking about drawing people, opportunities to draw people and so on. If we look at the drawing on the two sides here, and we look at the drawing in the center, I mean, it's like, what happened? Pardon?
So it doesn't look like the same kid.
No, I mean, if I were to show you this without what I've just told you, you would say that, maybe a third grader drew this one and a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old drew the other one. But because you're seeing very, very little difference in that month's time between the two drawings, and yet the one in the center is quite remarkable. It's beyond, in a way, our realization that the child who drew this and this could in reality draw that. Now I can attest that this actually was the case. But I think this demonstrates kind of what I'm trying to say, is that the reinforcement of the instruction is the critical piece. So again, there's a ton of these up here, and you're all really welcome to look at them later on. I'll just pick out a few of my favorite ones. This is another one done with a student in a class where the child had opportunities to study the figure and to draw and so on. And over here you've got this really funky little, every time I look at this one, Dave, I have to say I think of Onfim because he has those, you know, the forked fingers and everything, like the drawing you see back there on the board. And then you make the comparison between this drawing, and it's like, wow. Again, did the same child actually draw the two images? Yes, they did. But what's interesting about this one is that you even see similarities in the way that the decorations or the coloring or whatever occurs on the drawing. So does instruction make a difference? Is it important for us to do the job as art teachers? How does this whole idea work when we think about our students? Another interesting part about this study too is that for those of you that have taken the child development in the arts class here at Micah, you probably already know that one of the things that's often talked about is the fact that the stick people, you know, those little characters with the head and the stick and the arms coming out, are in reality not a natural developmental drawing for children. They really don't actually draw people that way. It's learned. So most times you're going to see children who, for whatever reason, have picked up this particular drawing. So another thing that can happen as a result of instruction, this is actually done by a student that was obviously influenced perhaps by an older brother or sister, maybe they're in an after-school program, drew a stick person, like you might see a 4th or 5th grade child draw. What happened here then, in instructing and talking about the body having, you know, shape to it, having thickness to arms and legs, having separation between the head and the body, and all the sorts of things that you would discuss in the drawing lesson, we have, instead of the stick person on this side, a drawing that the child has created with an actual form of a body. So the stick person, in essence, disappears. And this is an example of what can happen when we talk about the cultural conventions of American children and what they pick up. You know, it's not natural for children to draw the McDonald birds. They learn how to do that. It's not natural for children to draw stick people. They learn how to do that. Is that development? Isn't instruction? Well, I'll leave that answer really up to you. The thing that I'm trying to do now is, and this will be some time in the coming, I'm doing a long-term sort of longitudinal study now of some of the children that the School District of Lancaster is sort of supporting to show how the art instruction and art as a part of their early childhood education in particular may or may not influence their later learning. Many of you may have been reading articles in educational journals and newspapers and so on about the fact that reading and writing requirements are being pushed further and further down in the schools. And now kindergarten teachers, against their own knowledge and better judgment, are in essence being forced to teach children to read in kindergarten. Children who are basically not really ready to read. And one of the things that is a component of anybody that's been an early childhood advocate, as I am, is play, learn through play. Froebel says play is children's work, and I firmly believe that. But play is being sort of factored out of much of what children were doing. And the School District of Lancaster hopes to, through my research and the work of some of my students, to begin to show how important really the play is to young children, particularly since the city schools are going to both 3- and 4-year-old kindergartens, in addition to 5-year-old kindergartens. Rhoda Kellogg maintains, and again, I think from my studies, this proves to be true, that the children who don't have opportunities to just scribble on pieces of paper are not going to learn to read and write because they can't differentiate symbol systems and they don't develop the ability. This is another example of a huge leap for a child. We have the drawing, and again, I'm not sure how well some of you can see the initial drawings because they're rather tentative for some of the children. And you see the drawing in the center, and then again, you know, a month later, the drawing on the opposite side. We also see sometimes, and this is always something that, this particular one is an example I like to use also. This was a child that was in the kindergarten class which wasn't having any sort of reinforcement. But this one is unique because, in fact, all three of the drawings, you would probably say the same child did. So that the kid is really much further along in their visual and graphic development than the first one, for example, that I showed you. And you don't see a whole huge difference other than color between any of the three drawings. So this one then begins to raise the question, is, regardless of instruction, is there a leveling off that happens for children? And then how much change will go on if we teach them? So the question here would be, obviously the addition of pattern and so on the dress over here may have been taken from the learned portion. But would in fact this child's drawing go much, much further if it was sort of if the child was in a reinforced instruction program, or would it have remained pretty much the same because that was where they were at least temporarily leveling off in their learning and their development? I'm not going to pontificate for hours and hours on this, although like Al, give me a picture, I can talk forever. But what I would like to sort of put into your own mind is to understand the fact that what does it mean to be a teacher? And this is very definitely Kurlavich's definition of it. But being a real teacher goes back to trying to define what children do know, or at the very least what we believe they should know at any given point, and figuring out how we move them forward. Now, having said that, it's important to realize that when we say moving forward, it has to go beyond the temporary moving forward that may take place in that one time a week art class that we have with our students. How do we, as teachers, create the kind of an atmosphere in our schools that is being created in the work with the kindergarten teachers in this instant? How do we get that importance of art, the development of art, the reason for it being valuable outside the art room and into the rest of the schools? Dave Baker once said in a class that I had in my doctoral program with him one time, in his usual passionate manner, pounding on the table or something, he made the comment that he used to get really, really upset because art teachers should be leading the parade and not sweeping up after the elephants. It's a very typical Baker statement, but I think it's also true. We need to think about how you can not only understand issues of development, include all of these wonderful ideas that you've heard today, but really caring about your children. Use the arts not only for their visual and graphic and aesthetic development, but also as a component of their holistic development. And as I said earlier, these will be here. Y'all are welcome to take a look at them. The blue ones are for the kids who were in the uninstructed or unreinforced classes. The green ones are in the control group that had continuous involvement and interaction with images and figures. Any questions that anybody has? So there was basically a month between the before and after drawing. And the reason that we used markers, quite frankly, there were crayons on the tables, but the children basically chose the markers because a lot of the kids at 5 really liked that. You'll notice a lot of the original drawings, the kids did use crayons. We used markers for the instructed lesson just simply because we wanted to have the richer color. And frankly, being selfish, they're easier to photograph. My looking into this goes back to conversations that I had with Jan years and years ago about the whole Envisioning Writing program that she started in the schools. And I sort of took it down a little bit further because I'm very curious as to is how the language influences and where that leveling off is. And I don't have a complete answer because the work with the School District of Lancaster is only in its beginning of its second year, and we're still trying to figure out how we're actually going to track that. But I will tell you the one thing that we have done is to begin to compare children's development of their writing skills with the development of their graphic skills, which is a logical sort of a connection. But what we're introducing this year, which I find very exciting, particularly since many of our children that are low readers and writers are highly verbal. What we're trying to look at now, based on some studies done by Pat Tarr at not British Columbia, Calgary, University of Calgary, and some work also done by Christine Thompson, who's at Penn State now, on the Vygotskian idea of the social interaction as a piece of development. So we're looking at that as well. So I don't have a complete answer yet. I'd say probably at least a third or more were English, non-English, or English as a second language speakers. The school district Lancaster has close to 60% of our students who are English as a second language.
60?
60.
Wow.
Our largest minority population in the school district of Lancaster is Hispanic, primarily Puerto Rican.
And I just want to say that when I taught elementary art, the reading recovery teacher in our district would come to my art group because I would do a lesson on trees and just happen, because I always like tree tests also. So their first lesson was to draw a tree. We were talking about the apples, trees. And she would come, I'd always hang them on the wall, but she would come and search through all the artwork to see which students would need reading recovery, because they were not yet readers. And she would, she wouldn't let me not do that lesson, because it gave her the information she needed to help select and then design the reading recovery programs. So that would be a great client for anybody interested, as well as your work. I think that group is doing an enormous amount of work with visual images and reading. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, let's give Mary Ann a round of applause. Thank you.